Hello, everybody. So, podcast on finding the period of a graph. Okay, the period it takes for something to repeat, like our a year. That's the time it takes for us to go around the sun. The period of our orbit is 1 year. Okay. The period of a day is 24 hours. Okay. It's the time, it's the distance it takes before it starts repeating. Okay. So on a trig function, there's going to be two different ways that you guys can look at this. And you either look from peak to peak or valley to valley, or look at from where the midline strikes the midline. Okay, so I think the midline is right here. Now you need to be a little bit careful when I say that, midline to midline. So let's say I'm starting here. Sure, it hits the midline there, but you got to skip one, you got to alternate. Because again, it's the distance it takes for this graph to repeat. That isn't a repeat. Now I'm going to start repeating exactly what I did before. That is one full period, okay? Because it has all the values above the midline, all the values above, and it has all the values below the midline, okay? Now, this one, if I say from peak to peak, so from here to here is the same distance, okay? How long does it take for it to start to repeat itself? This is one period, okay? This is going downhill, now it's going uphill. When does it start going downhill again? It starts going downhill over here. So that's one full period, okay? I usually think of it as from midline from point to point, okay? Skipping one, okay? But peak to peak is another way to do it. So let me get rid of some of this on here. If I go peak to peak, what you're looking for is that distance. So you'd have to go 5 pi over 8 minus pi over 8, which is going to be 4 pi over 8, which is going to be pi over 2. That's its period. Okay? Now, another way to get it, like I said, was off the midline. Here's the midline. If it's starting here, I skip one and go to this one. What's that number that's there? Pi over 2. Okay? That's the period. The period is the distance it takes to repeat. Okay? So, we can either look peak to peak or valley to valley. But doing that takes a little bit of subtraction. So you go pi over 2 minus pi over 10. So you'd have to get a common denominator, which would be 5 pi over 10 minus pi over 10, which could give you 4 pi over 10, which would give you 2 pi over 5. Or, you look at the midline. Oops, sorry, I'm drawing the midline in the wrong spot. This is the midline. If it's starting here, skip this one, ending there. Okay, because that's one full cycle. And what's the answer? 2 pi over 5. Okay. Okay, this is the midline right here. Midline, skip one, another midline. What's that distance? Pi over 2. That's its period. Okay. Midline. Looks like it's right there. Starting here, ending there, 6 pi. That's the distance from 0 to 6 pi. That's its period. Okay. Okay, peak to peak. Doing the midline on this one doesn't really go here. This is the midline. Okay, but looking at it here, it's like, yeah, no, it's not a value there. Okay, so I'm saying peak to peak. There you go, it's pi. There's no subtracting that has to happen. Okay, to do the midline, you'd have to go from this point, skip one, this point. So you'd have to go 3 pi over 4 minus a negative pi over 4, which is plus 3 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4, which would be pi, which why not just go peak to peak in this case then, and there it is, pi. Okay? So again, looking at peak to peak, the distance is 2 pi over 3. So how do I know whether to use peak to peak or the midline? Well, this is starting, the peak is starting on the y-axis. The peak is starting on the y-axis. The peak is not starting on the y-axis, but the midline is starting on the y-axis. Okay? The midline was right here. It's starting on the y-axis. It's starting on the y-axis. The peaks aren't starting on the y-axis. Okay? So that's when it's easier to use one versus the other. Okay? It's starting on the y-axis. What's that distance? Pi. So the period is pi. Okay? There you go. Thank you guys for your time. Have yourself